can look at on the system very precisely anyway. There are things you can look at on the system, but it's harder. We can go through and look and see how the browser handles different types of content, ask it how it can handle it. We can even use the DOM, the document object model, and ask navigators.plugins how to do that. And that is another way. So since these are ways we can identify it, we're going to have to come up with ways to lie to every one of these, basically, or to defeat every one of these combinations. So the easiest thing is to just, if someone is going to single you out for some reason, just look like not a random person, but maybe you want to look like somebody else, and then they can't tell you the difference between you, right? So you don't, everybody doesn't have to look the same, but if you look the same as a few other people that are fairly unique, maybe that's good enough, right? Because if they're unique enough, then how are they going to, and you're really good at mimicking them, it's going to be really hard to tell the two of you apart. The real problem there is then you're really trusting in how good that person is, and, you know, being, you're giving up a little control, right? Now you're going to have to mimic that person whenever they do. So it's like when, you know, your sibling or whoever would start mimicking you, and you start punching yourself so that they punch themselves. I mean, you've given up control of some of your behavior. So I don't know how I feel about giving up control, but it's an interesting idea that I don't have to be entirely random. I can only just mimic somebody else. And if there's enough people mimicking other people, but not all mimicking the same person, maybe that's still good enough to anonymize us collectively. All right? Now, of course, to do that, we want to sanitize input and output. We want to anonymize and randomize our behavior as well. All right? We can either fake it, whatever they're looking for the identifying bits, or maybe we can engineer it ahead of time. So defeating the header detection, we could generalize request headers at URL and host. This is fairly easy. Proxies can handle this for us. They do an okay job of that currently, right? If we really wanted to mix it up, though, and really ratchet up the anonymization here, if you redo your proxies so that they jumble as much of the headers as they can get away with, of course, you know, there's certain requirements. The host header, you have the GET request, and the host header can't be too randomized because they're your destination, right? If you randomize it, you're not going to where you want it to. And so that's pretty much our limitation there. But we could do that, maybe add some benign headers, maybe some benign parameters, just to kind of jumble things up and make it look a little bit more random, you know, increase that noise level. And then maybe what we want to do for the cookie stuff to detect you is we want to take control back of our cookies. All right, don't let the browser decide when to send them, when to clear them, and do everything else. An easy way to get started is to make a browser helper object, for example, or an extension, clear all the cookies on browser open. What if your browser crashed and you're used to just clearing things when you close? Well, when you pop it back up now, there's that leak. I also think it's kind of neat to be able to groom your cookies. Stash them somewhere outside the browser, and if you do want them back, then you can actually dictate when they go back into your browser and can be sent to the server. So the components are there, but I haven't seen a plugin that really lets you automate that nicely. And so that was one of the things we wanted to add into the suite, which we still have a lot of work to do. History enumeration, go everywhere, at least the top 500 sites. Now, you don't have to manually go there. You can have a plugin do it for you, right? Have it go to the top 500, and then go through and delete your history so that any extra things you go to that aren't in the top 500 aren't there. Now that itself is a pattern that can identify you, but if we all did that, now it's normal, right? Somebody might be able to identify as that, gee, that's somebody with that tool, or that's somebody who was at DEF CON who heard about that technique, but not necessarily who it was. And if we do enough of these randomization things, as we keep building this up, maybe that's enough to keep us fairly, you know, fairly safe as far as anonymizing our privacy concerns. But it's probably not good enough just to hit the sites. We probably want to do a little bit of crawling, make it look kind of real, maybe mistype a request once in a while. to really make it look like, both from the wire and from a media analysis standpoint, that maybe one might even call it anti-forensics, that it wouldn't look that weird on the drive, right? Font detection is tough, though. Basically, because of the wonderful things that Flash lets you do, it asks for fonts. Or it's easy to ask for fonts, I should say. Now we can take something and make our own Flash engine, use the JavaScript Flash interpreter that exists, and throw out that. But it's harder. Now at least we can fingerprint, that people have done something to try and block the Flash, call it the fonts. So we could do that. I actually prefer the idea of just changing your environment. So if you start with a virtual machine that has a clean install, then you have less font moving you have to do, but with no extra supplemental fonts installed that come with your third-party plugins, there's not going to be much to fingerprint. You look like a generic XP Service Pack 2 or whatever that never got any plugins, never got any third-party Acrobat installed or something like that. There's a huge cost, though, that takes us time. If we're downloading these randomly from an archive and uninstalling them randomly, that's going to take time. But it is possible to randomize those system fonts, even locally, with just a outside the browser tool, right? But I like the idea of being able to create a snapshot. So let's make a snapshot of Acrobat 6 and Internet Explorer 8 and whatever, and then that'll be a signature. And then you can groom your browser to look like that. I think that would be the way to go. But the problem is we've got a lot of work to do. We've got to collect a lot of different signatures that way. So that's one of the reasons we want to start the project, is to start collecting those signatures so that people could pick and say, I want to look like this combination of fonts. Some technical details on it. We can use a couple of ways here to detect some fonts. Defeating it, well, we can munge those calls. We can go through and just break the call so that it doesn't answer correctly, doesn't even call it correctly. Or we could even catch the response and make it lie. And there's actually an example at the end in a screenshot of how we can do that. The JavaScript way in the same way, right? We can catch it, or maybe it's better to create benign fake fonts. I wouldn't say it's better. It actually slows down your machine greatly, having tried this. But if I have a font that's every single possible realistic combination of width and height, then you can't really distinguish me from another me that has the same benign fonts. The problem is the system really slows down when you put a lot of fonts on. And so that's not as realistic, but maybe we can at least fake the common ones. So a couple ways to do that. We can just move things in and out. That's okay. We have a little registry shenanigans we got to perform, but it's possible, especially if you really are concerned with your privacy. Maybe in your situation that works for you. It would be nice to have the option, is what I'm saying. And then there's some similarities between the font and the plugin detection that we have to use to try and get around things. It all comes down to if we can either create a normal fingerprint or throw out what we have to become normal. That's probably good enough to get around the bulk of the identifying information that tools like Panopticlick have proven it's easy to do. Now, if we're jumbling these things around as we're doing it, that creates a lot of complications, so it's a concern. And it gets even harder as browser things change, right? As plugins change and as Adobe writes a new function for the next version of Flash that does the same thing the other ones did in a differently broken way, now we've got to do that one. So it's problematic. Now, specifically with those plugins, what's the problem? I mentioned, if everybody else normal becomes bad, right? I don't want to now look bad necessarily, but maybe I can do fake plugins. And it's actually not that hard, not as hard as I thought anyway. We can register CLS IDs in the registry for Windows folks, and then we can do MIME types and redirect them to benign plugins that do nothing. just to make it look like we have those. Again, creates a new pattern though, because if you have a page that does the fingerprinting that tries to actually use those plugins, like, hey, do you have Windows Media video streaming? And you say you do, but when you run the Windows Media video that has a JavaScript call, an embedded script that goes and does something else, and that behavior never happens, obviously you don't really have that. But again, if enough of us do it, if there's enough people that have that fingerprint, then we all look the same as that set of fingerprints. Okay. And that has less of a performance impact than the font things. It can be tough to fake, but it is possible. The real problem is in the plugins always updating and changing. So now we have to fake every plugin version that comes out. So that's a little tough, which means we basically have to brute force and enter into the registry every combination of possible CSL ID in Windows, for example. And maybe we can just not do everything because of that problem. Maybe we do the top 100 of those plugins, top most 100 common ones. And maybe that's good enough. And of course, Safari and Opera don't have that many extensions and plugins. At the time I wrote this slide, there wasn't that many, but we can at least make it look like you have that many. And maybe that's good enough to remove some of those bits of identified information. Other things, now with exploiting, like a classic pivoting, I say classic, like one of those beautiful pivoting attacks where you make the web browser scripting language do the port scanning for you, or some other enumeration like making an image link to a UNC path on the network where Windows networking goes out, tries to look for an image. If there's not an image at that IP address locally, then that machine might not be up, depending upon how it errors, you know, is how some of that works. But these are problematic because proxies that are out there that are available to us only capture HTTP, HTTPS, FTP. They don't catch these extra things that Internet Explorer added in, like Windows networking, the res call to pull in different resources from DLLs. So we have to think outside of a proxy. We have to either hijack the system or the browser itself. Hijacking the system's kind of tough because we need visibility into what the browser's doing. Turns out that the browser helper objects are perfect to, well, perfectly positioned anyway to deal with this. All right, we can hijack the scheme that call to the resource. But true anonymity is going to be tough. We're not trying to do that. We're just trying to get a little bit of privacy, right? It's like the privacy a bathroom stall door gives you. It's enough privacy to get your business taken care of. Well, for most of us. So I'm trying not to let my imagination run wild. Sorry. A little too much caffeine. So in our defense, if we can hijack everything that the browser's doing instead of just those schemes with a proxy, which we can do, then maybe we'll be in good shape. For example, this at the bottom is one thing you can try. It happened to work on my Windows 7 box, so it still works on IE8. But you can go through and at least tell a little bit about the system, you know, what version you have. Here it's local, but I can still maybe try to do that over the network. Well, defeating stuff over the network isn't terrible. It actually is a little easier than I thought. If you've never used Proxychains or Proxify, you should try it. It's a little weird to wrap your mind around sometimes because the documentation's a little bit limited. But the whole idea is we can take something in any TCP or any network traffic it does, send through a proxy even though it's not proxy aware. We're wrapping the application in something that is proxy aware. That actually works pretty well for catching other things the browser does against your network. All right, an example here that I have is actually a little code snippet from the project, from the X06D inside of JScript. We match on RFC 1918 private IP addresses or the loopback start, and if that's there, we override it. But we don't just deny it, we send it somewhere. We send it to a null-routed IP that This is actually the one that Code Red used to denial of service the